Why it sucks to be a dancing Bacha boy in medieval Afghanistan. There are parts of history that are genuinely uncomfortable to talk about, not because they're violent or strange or bizarre, but because they reveal something deeply disturbing about how societies can normalize the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable people imaginable. This is one of the stories. Bacha Bazi. Translated literally from Dari, it means boy play. The name itself is deceptively innocent. The reality behind it was anything but. This is not entertainment. This is not curiosity. This is the history of children who were exploited by powerful men while entire societies looked away. And it deserves to be told honestly. Bacha Bazi was a practice that existed across parts of Central Asia, particularly Afghanistan, for centuries. At its core, it involved young boys, particularly between 9 and 15 years old, being kept by wealthy and powerful men for entertainment and sexual exploitation. The boys were called Bacha Barish, boys without beards, the very name defining them by their youth and vulnerability. These weren't boys who chose this life. They came almost exclusively from desperately poor families, families who had nothing, families destroyed by decades of war and poverty, families who sometimes didn't fully understand what was being offered when a wealthy man expressed interest in their son. Sometimes families who understood completely but had no power to refuse. The powerful men who kept these boys, called arbabs or commanders, were often warlords, local officials, businessmen, or military figures. Men with money, weapons, and authority. Men who operated in environments where their behavior faced no accountability. The boys were dressed in women's clothing. They were taught to dance. They performed at parties and gatherings for groups of men. And after the performances, they were subjected to sexual abuse. This is the reality that needs to be stated plainly without euphemism. These were children being systematically sexually abused by powerful men who faced no consequences. Understanding how children entered this situation requires understanding the environment that made it possible. Afghanistan has experienced decades of war, poverty, and institutional collapse. In environments where government authority barely exists, where law enforcement is corrupt or absent, where poverty is absolute and desperate, the protection that societies normally provide to children simply doesn't function. Recruiters, men who worked for the arbabs, would travel to poor villages and approach struggling families. Sometimes they offered money, sometimes they promised the boy would receive education and opportunities. Sometimes they simply took boys whose families had no power to resist. Once a boy was in the arbab's household, escape was nearly impossible. The arbab had wealth, weapons, and connections. The boy had nothing. Running meant having nowhere to go, no resources, and the risk of being returned or punished. Some boys were kept for years, through their early adolescence and into their late teens. As they aged and grew, they eventually were released, discarded when they were no longer young enough to serve the arbab's purposes. The psychological damage inflicted on Bacha Bazi boys was profound and lasting. They were taken during critical developmental years and subjected to repeated sexual trauma. They were stripped of normal childhood development, normal education, normal social bonds. They were dressed and presented as female while being male, creating profound confusion about identity and self. When they were eventually released, usually in their late teens, they returned to communities that often shunned them. In Afghan culture, being a Bacha Bazi boy carried enormous stigma. Communities knew what had happened. And rather than viewing these young men as victims, they were frequently treated as shameful, as damaged and untouchable. They couldn't easily marry. They couldn't easily reintegrate into normal social life. They carried trauma that no name in their culture had, and no treatment was available to them. Many struggled with severe psychological damage for the rest of their lives. Some former Bacha Bazi boys reported that the only life available to them afterward was to become arbabs themselves, perpetuating the cycle because they had no other path and no other model for how to live. The cycle of abuse perpetuating itself through generations of damaged men. This is what happens when children are systematically exploited with no intervention and no support. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bacha Bazi's history. It wasn't hidden, it was known, and powerful people consistently chose to ignore it or actively enabled it. For centuries, Bacha Bazi existed in a cultural space where it was simultaneously acknowledged and not discussed. It was an open secret. Everyone knew it happened. Nobody with power to stop it chose to do so. Local religious authorities who publicly condemned homosexuality between adults often stayed silent about Bacha Bazi. The powerful men who practiced it were the same men who funded mosques and religious institutions. Challenging them meant losing support and protection. Government officials who could have prosecuted these men were often the same men or friends of the same men. Accountability was impossible when the perpetrators were the authority. When foreign military forces arrived in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, soldiers reported being ordered not to intervene when they witnessed Bacha Bazi. The political calculation was that confronting Afghan commanders and warlords about this practice would damage military alliances needed for the broader conflict. Children were being abused. Soldiers knew it. And they were ordered to look away because the geopolitical math determined that alliance with the abusers was more valuable than protection of the victims. This is how institutional failures compound each other. Local religious silence enables local political silence, enables international political silence. And children pay the price for every layer of that silence. Here's what matters most about this history. The boys. Not the powerful men who abused them, not the political calculations that protected those men, not the cultural frameworks that explained away what was happening. The boys, children who had no voice, no power, no protection, and no choice. They existed in the gaps between every system that should have protected them. Their families were too poor and powerless. Their communities were too intimidated or complicit. Their governments were too corrupt. The international community was too strategically compromised. Nobody chose them. Nobody stood up for them. Many of them are still alive today, living with the consequences of what was done to them as children, carrying trauma in societies that still don't fully acknowledge them as victims, still navigating lives shaped by abuse they had no power to prevent or escape. Their stories deserve to be told not as entertainment, not as historical curiosity, but as a record of institutional failure and human cruelty that we should be unwilling to forget. Because forgetting is how these things continue. Bacha Bazi didn't end with history. It continued into the 20th century and beyond. Documented cases exist from the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. It persisted because the conditions that enabled it persisted. Poverty, war, institutional collapse, powerful men without accountability, vulnerable children without protection. When the Taliban first took powers in the 1990s, they explicitly banned Bacha Bazi and executed some practitioners. This created a strange historical footnote where one of the most brutal regimes in modern history provided more protection to these specific children than the governments and international forces that came after. When Taliban control collapsed and warlords regained power, the practice resumed. When the Taliban returned to power in 2021, it was again officially prohibited. The history of Bacha Bazi is ultimately a history of what happens to the most vulnerable people when every system that should protect them fails simultaneously. When poverty removes family protection, when corruption removes government protection, when cultural silence removes community protection, when political calculation removes international protection. Children fall through every gap, and they pay with their childhoods, their mental health, and often their entire lives. We tell dark histories for different reasons, sometimes for entertainment, sometimes for curiosity, sometimes because understanding darkness is the only way to prevent it. This history needs to be told for the last reason. The boys who lived through Bacha Bazi across centuries of Afghan history were not curiosities, they were not footnotes, they were children who deserved protection that they never received. Telling their story honestly, without flinching, without sanitizing, and without turning their suffering into entertainment is the minimum respect their experience deserves. These children existed. They suffered. They were failed by every system and every adult who should have protected them. That should matter to us. Their history should make us uncomfortable. It should make us angry. It should make us ask hard questions about how societies fail vulnerable children and what it costs when they do. Because the answer to those questions is measured in stolen childhoods and broken lives. And those children deserved so much better than what history gave them.